there is a real need for scholarship on contemporary anti-Semitism. We're trying in a way to create a discipline of contemporary anti-Semitism studies. And I would say as a scholar, and now we're getting into the weeds of really trying to have I'm going to present a scholarly perspective on issues of contemporary anti-Semitism, is that many of the work on contemporary anti-Semitism, in my view, is quite descriptive. And unlike the study of other social problems and issues and contradictions in society, I mentioned yesterday the study of issues of racism and sexism and homophobia, there really isn't a body of literature that is sort of analytical. So for example, a lot of us are writing about contemporary anti-Semitism and the explosion of anti-Semitism after October the 7th. Everybody is aware. And those who deny it are, enemies of truth, forget enemies of the Jewish people. But the question as scholars is, why now? Why now? Why in 2024, 2023? Why this explosion of anti-Semitism? Why this explosion of xenophobia and nationalism? Why? And if anti-Semitism is sort of an early warning system, as Elie Wiesel said, anti-Semitism begins with the Jews, but it doesn't end with the Jews. It's sort of an early warning system for something deeper, structural in society. So, and we know historically, if we look at the explosion of anti-Semitism in Europe between the First and Second World War, and even before, but particularly between the two world wars, we know as historians that the social, economic, and political conditions were ripe for the rise of totalitarian movements and anti-Semitic movements. And the Nazis and other reactionary or extreme or totalitarian movements often used anti-Semitism, as I think Babel was saying, the socialism of fools, right? You look at the Jews, and you look at the capitalists and the Jews and the bankers and the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and the totalitarian movements focus on the Jew while they try to transform society. So we know that historically. But I think there's too little attention today of understanding why it's happening now. And if we even take a step back, it's fascinating. I was speaking with David Hirsch a little bit about it yesterday. In a sense, the American Jewish community for decades was saying that anti-Semitism was a problem of the Middle East. It was a problem between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and if only those stubborn Israelis and Palestinians can resolve their land disputes, everything will be okay. And that the rise of Hamas and the anti-Israel discourse was not anti-Semitic, it was anti-Zionist, and it will be okay. But we saw the rise of radical political Islam sort of sweeping parts of the Middle East, of North Africa, of East Africa, West Africa, parts of Asia. States are failing, right? The vacuum is being filled by these movements. When anti-Semitism swept through Europe, France, Belgium, Spain, Britain, right? American Jewish organizations and leaders were saying, it's a problem of European anti-Semitism, and the Europeans have been anti-Semitic for a long time, but this cannot happen here. And it was starting to happen in South America and in Canada, but it could not happen in the United States because the United States is different, right? But then October 7th happened, and everything that was beneath the surface exploded to the point where one could argue that the threat of anti-Semitism in the United States of America in higher education, in the institution of higher education, the most important institution in a society where young people learn to be citizens, in the halls of power, in media, in the media of record, that anti-Semitism is really permeated, institutionalized in the United States, and our community wasn't aware. It wasn't prepared, because they had the assumption that America was exceptional and it could not happen here. But we know, especially now in this globalized world of social media and interconnectivity, of economics and political and social processes and cultural processes, that no space is an island, no matter how exceptional they are or we think they are. That we're all interconnected in this sort of globalization. So I think the challenge as scholars, not journalists, right? Not just simply doing descriptive analysis, sort of functional analysis, if I can use that term, is no longer, I would say, perhaps relevant. Or if we're going to do serious case studies, rich in data, rich in empirical analysis and data is fine, but we need to find a framework. We need to understand the power dynamics in society and how society is changing. And what is changing? How is it changing? What's driving the changes? Who's driving the changes, right? And I think once we start to understand these processes, then we can sort of, I would say, understand in a more analytical manner why it's happening now and what is happening now. Not just simply describing the situation, but trying to understand it. If we can understand the dynamics in this sort of rapidly changing crisis of anti-Semitism, crisis of capitalism, if I may say, we can start, once we understand the problem, we can start to maybe develop policies and approaches to try to remedy it, or perhaps even just to weather the storm. So I'm going to be brutal, and I'm going to give you the history of anti-Semitism in a few minutes, so forgive me. And, we can do many, many lectures and courses on the history of anti-Semitism. But I would argue that there are three general phases of anti-Semitisms with an S. And I'm being very general. And I think what makes anti-Semitism and anti-Semitisms unique, as Robert Wistrich, often taught, is that there's something inherently genocidal about anti-Semitism. And this is what distinguishes Jew hatred, I would argue, from other forms of bigotry, of hatred, of racism. In a way, what Deborah Lipstadt argued in her work is that the bigot, when it comes to being, when it comes to racism, the bigot in their imagination punches down, right? But the bigot, when it comes to anti-Semitism, punches up. And they punch up because of the conspiracy theories and the stereotypes that Jews are sort of omnipresent and powerful and, pull the strings of society and control the banks and the media and Hollywood and all this garbage. And it's sort of this conspiracies that are intertwined in different forms of anti-Semitism. So I would argue that the first phase of anti-Semitism, at least in the modern era, is Christian anti-Semitism. There was the perception, I'm sure as all of you know, that the Jew was blinded by evil because they didn't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah. They didn't accept the truth, which was the obligation in many instances for the Christian to spread the Gospels, to bring the truth to society, and that the stubborn Jew didn't accept the truth, and that if the Jew didn't accept the truth, they couldn't have redemption with God. They were sort of, blinded by evil. They couldn't be connected to God. And what made anti-Semitism sort of inherently genocidal is the belief that not only was the Jew blinded by evil and couldn't have redemption, but that the stubborn Jew was hindering the coming of redemption for everybody. Right? So if the Jew was going to be converted or forced out or murdered, this is the Spanish Inquisition, that somehow redemption would come. So redemption was being held up by the stubborn Jew. So this is sort of the inherent genocidal part, because the Jew had to be civilized, with love or with brutality. The second phase of anti-Semitisms, I think when the dominant view of society, of reality, shifted from religion to notions of biology, of racial identities and ethnic identities, sort of biologically determined identities, the Jew was perceived as not part of the white Aryan race and nation, and that the Jew was poisoning the purity of the white Aryan nation. And unlike Christianity, where there was a way out of murder, the Jew could have been converted and saved their lives and maybe saved their souls. When it came to race, we have to understand, and this is the legacy of Western thought, of philosophy and social sciences and the hard sciences, was that race was something inherent. There was no conversion from race in the Western imagination. People like von Herder and all the Enlightenment thinkers, believed in this notion of race, that the white race, the sort of constructed notion of whiteness, was at the top, they were supreme. The African was on the bottom of this hierarchy, this ladder of racial categorization. And it was interesting, Hegel and some of the great Enlightenment thinkers of European thinkers of its time, actually, it was the white man's burden. The obligation of the white person to enslave the African person was not just to get cheap labor, but was a way to civilize and uplift the African race, the black people, because they would be in contact with the supreme white people, and just by this contact they would elevate them. It's extraordinary. And I'll just say as an aside, I was in Ghana at one of these slave forts, or these places where the British had a fort, and the slaves would be held underneath the fort in these pens, and then they would be shipped out to the Americas. And what was extraordinary, there was these pits, these holding cells, and in these holding cells people were dying of all sorts of diseases, really suffering, and only the few fortunate ones were able to get on the ship, survive this, to get on the ship to go, and if they survived Middle Passage, they'd be enslaved in the Americas. But what was extraordinary, above these pens was just a wood floor, a simple wood floor with cracks in the wood floor, and on top of it was the church, the Anglican church. So you have people praying to God on the church, and no doubt hearing and smelling the human misery below them. So this disconnect of what is human, what is inferior, superior, it goes very deep into issues of identities, and certainly the legacy of slavery and Western identities and anti-Semitism. So the Jew was perceived as not being white and poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race, and they had to be eliminated. And there was no conversion. And this type of racist anti-Semitism culminates in the Holocaust, the brutality of it. Now we've kind of moved away from Christian anti-Semitism and racist anti-Semitism into this sort of postmodern attack on Jewish notions of identity. And the dominant form of anti-Semitism in the contemporary context, I think the old Christian and racist forms of anti-Semitism, it still circulates, but it's not the dominant one. The dominant anti-Semitism, as everybody now knows, especially when you go, on a Saturday on the streets of London, or if you go to an encampment at a good university in the United States, the attack of anti-Semitism predominantly, not entirely, but predominantly, rests on the attack of who Jews are as a people, and its connection to the land of Israel. So this we all know. And people will argue, that if Israel would be dismantled and destroyed, the Jewish people would be saved. There'd be no more anti-Semitism, right? If the shitty little country, as a French diplomat said years ago, would disappear, the Jews would be okay and the world would be saved. So this is like the old narratives changing its focus. In the contemporary context too, what's extraordinary is that Israel has been labeled, as we heard yesterday, and I'm sure you all are aware, that Israel is sort of a racist, Israel is perceived as a racist apartheid state, a colonial project, an imperial project, an occupying project. And we have to remember, and this is crucial, if Israel is an apartheid state, from a liberal human rights perspective, we would be morally obligated to dismantle it. So when people say that Israel is an apartheid state, from a liberal human rights perspective, it's delegitimized, as Natan Sharansky was saying yesterday. So this is something we really have to remember, that when this discourse we hear in our classrooms call Israel an apartheid state, it means from a moral perspective, it doesn't have the legitimacy to exist. And if you are on the good side, if you're part of the group, I was talking to Misha earlier, if you're part of the in-group and part of this sort of new university culture, then you have to oppose Israel's existence. And what's also extraordinary is that you have leading intellectuals. This is really extraordinary if you take a step back and think about it. You have leading intellectuals in Oxford and Cambridge. Some of us here, Larry and Barbara, there was a few of us who were at a major conference in 2019 that was put on by a friend of mine who was the first African professor of race relations at Oxford. And he's a friend of the Jewish people. He's a good guy, cares about anti-Semitism. And it was a major international conference on African studies and looking at issues of colonialism, racism, and he invited us to present on issues of anti-Semitism. And I put out a call for papers with him, and we had 3 panels, or I think there were 20 panels in this international conference. 3 were by ISGAP scholars. Larry, Barbara, Yossi Shane was here, Abraham Negusa, who was a member of the Knesset in Israel, a philosopher, a rabbi, born in Ethiopia, walked to Israel. Ansel Brown, Harold Bennett, the Martin Luther King Professor of Theology at Morehouse College. He is the Martin Luther King Chair of Theology and Philosophy at Morehouse College. That's the preeminent place with the Martin Luther King legacy. And we all walked in there, and we were banned. There were 120 professors from all over the best universities in the world, and there was one professor from Ghana who said it's not right to kick all these professors out. And we were all kicked out. And we were all kicked out because we're white supremacists, even though some of us were African American, but we were all white supremacists. It's extraordinary. So in less than 2 generations, think about this. And this is coming from the classroom. This is coming from the best universities on the planet. That now Jews are perceived as white supremacists, apartheid supporters. So in less than 2 generations, Jews were systematically exterminated, removed from universities. Universities were the only institution that voluntarily gave up its Jews. Not the police, not the unions, not the military, the universities. Faculty and students were removed voluntarily. So in these universities, they are teaching that Jews who were systematically exterminated for not being white, in less than 2 generations, these intellectual clowns, they're imposters, are now saying that Jews are white and white supremacists and apartheid supporters and occupiers and genocidal now. Extraordinary. It's extraordinary that anybody has the chutzpah to say this. It's extraordinary that this passes as scholarship. And Emmanuel Castells in terms of power, and this is very important, power. The Jews are the powerful people, but think about it. The Jewish people in the United States of America, particularly, I have to say, do not have the capacity to have self-identity. We don't know how to identify ourselves anymore. We've always been, or largely been, defined by the enemy. We're not white, we must be murdered. We are white in such a flash of time that we don't have a right to self-determination, and that we're the cause of so much havoc and pain and destruction and violence and death of babies. We don't have a right to exist. And this, once again, it's not coming out of the departments of eugenics and science and biology and theology as it did, and philosophy. The underpinnings of the Holocaust came out of the best universities in Europe. The underpinnings of the Holocaust came out of the best universities in Europe. The intellectual foundations, the science, the medicine. We have one colleague from Brown University doing the legacy of medicine in the Holocaust. This intellectual foundation was, Nietzsche, and it goes on and on. The anti-Semitism in philosophy and theology and science justified the Holocaust. And I have to say, once again, that the intellectuals are at the forefront, they're at the cutting edge of defining the Jew. Not based on Jewish terms, but defining the Jew. The enemies of the Jews always define the Jew. And I think it's time, and there's one small project that we're trying to get underway at ISGAP, on notions of Jewish consciousness, which comes out of the Black consciousness movement and Stephen Biko. And my mentor, the professor who got me to Oxford, was the teacher of Stephen Biko. And they created this whole notion of Black consciousness, taking their identity that was devoid of any substance. The colonizer said these people are black, end of story. But Black consciousness said, no, we're not just black, or we are black and we're beautiful, but we're more than that. We have a culture, we have a cosmology, we have philosophy, we're connected to the earth. They went back to their wisdom to empower themselves, to connect to their identity, to define themselves, and then struggle against the real apartheid. And I think it's what we're trying to do in this project is have Jewish consciousness. The blessing of the Jewish people is that we have our wisdom and teachings and books intact. Unlike other groups of then displaced and colonized that have been disconnected deeply from their roots, we have Mr. Zuckerman here from Australia, whose father's a linguist, who has spent his life helping indigenous people recapture their language, using Israel as the model that indigenous people should use that have been disconnected from their culture and language. So it's Gilad Zuckerman, who's an old friend from Oxford. So very, very important. So I think the key is that we have to become aware at a very elementary level. If we're going to fight anti-Semitism, we can't allow the enemy to define ourselves. And the onslaught of our enemies defining ourselves is really, it's challenging. It can't be dismissed. Professors are saying Jews are white supremacists, and Jewish, particularly in the sort of racial formation of the United States, where race is so important and unique compared to other countries, and the American Jewish experience unique compared to other diaspora Jewish experiences in the Americas and Europe and Africa and Asia. Right? We have to remember that the American experience is not everybody's experience, but it's deep. And the defining of the Jew by American society as the white other is extraordinary. And so Emmanuel Castells, in his book on Power and Identity, argues that when you have power, you have the capacity, you have economic power, political power, social power, and that the basic, the minimal power that anybody has is the capacity to identify yourself, to have your own identity. And I think even at this level, Jewish identity is being, attacked. And if you disconnect Jewish people from their identity, then it's a very serious matter. So I think we talk about Jewish education. I think we really need to go back to understanding from a Jewish perspective what it is to be Jewish. And as Michal so eloquently said yesterday, that we're more than a religion, we're more than a culture, we're a people, we're a nation. And yes, we have different phenotypical features. And that's very important in the United States of America and in Europe and in the colonial imagination and framework. But from a Jewish perspective, very different, very different. So I think we really need to understand who we are as a people, and our friends and allies need to be educated from us and sharing with us what it is to be Jewish. So I think it's very important. I think we should really have a conversation among ourselves and explore what it is to be Jewish. Very important. And I think to question the sort of racialized identity of being Jewish. And just, as I say this to my American friends, and they don't quite get it, I don't think. But growing up in Montreal, there's a few Montrealers here, we never identified as being white. Even to this day, my nephews are young, beautiful young men. They don't identify as being white, they identify as being Jewish. Jewish Canadians, connected, and they have strong affiliation to Israel. But they see themselves as Jewish because whiteness in Canada was sort of the British and the French. These were the competing European colonial founding fathers, as they called themselves, of Confederation. And the Jew was the quintessential other. We were not white, we were Jewish. And particularly in Quebec, but also in the rest of Canada, I think it's similar in the European context, the British context, Jewish people living in England for generations and generations rarely call themselves English. They'll say we're British, but we're not English, right? So there's all these distinctions. So I think it's very important, particularly in the United States, for young American Jews to reconnect. And as scholars, I think we should really unpack this sort of notion of race in the United States and how race affects American society economically, politically, culturally. But also, as Jews in America, who are we? What are we? If we're white, I don't know, how does that connect to the American social formation, racial formation, and how does that connect to being connected to Israel as Jewish people? Why is this taking place? So in my work, from my perspective, and you don't have to agree with me, but I think it's something to consider, from my perspective, globalization plays an integral role in this sort of reemergence and explosion of anti-Semitism. If anti-Semitism is the early warning system, if the rise of, anti-Semitism from the left, from the right, and from political Islam is really exploding as it is, why is it happening? And I would argue that globalization and neoliberalism has played a crucial role in this moment. So what is globalization? So what I mean by globalization refers to, in the early 1980s, 1982, 1983, there was this notion of structural adjustment. The IMF and the World Bank, based on sort of free market, neoliberal free market models of development, they adopted this perspective of neoliberalism, which believed and believes that the more free market systems there are, the less restrictions there are on economic activity and free trade and development, economic development, the more that there'll be democratic development. The stronger the economy, the better democracy. And the best way to achieve this is to limit the power of the state, actually to lower the power of the state, so that it won't interfere in sectors of the economy. So after the Second World War, nations got together, they looked back at what happened during the Second World War and the Holocaust, and they said it will never allow the social and economic conditions to exist that gave rise to this horror. Not only were 6 million Jews exterminated, over 80 million Europeans murdered. The infrastructure of European society was decimated during the Second World War. So the world got together and said we would never do this again and never allow this to happen again. So everybody got together, they adopted notions of international human rights, and part of this regime was guaranteeing that people had access to housing, to employment, to food, to shelter, to basic forms of education, and that the state was going to guarantee a certain level of subsistence. Because they knew if people were disconnected from socio and economic and political institutions, that this gives rise to desperation, to fear, to xenophobia, and leads to totalitarianism and destruction. So this was the model. So countries like social democracies in Europe and in Canada, and to some extent in the United States and in Israel, the state was strong. Right? There were certain industries that were nationalized. So Canada, for example, nationalized airlines because it thought it was important to have airlines connecting people. The railroad in many countries was nationalized because it wasn't profitable. So the state would collect a lot of taxes, and they would subsidize these important industries. Healthcare, medicine. You know, growing up in Quebec, there was Quebec nationalism, there was anti-Semitism, racism, but we were all very proud of our healthcare system, of our education. So contrary to Fox News, you know, growing up in Canada with healthcare was a wonderful thing. It was the best healthcare system, I think, that I experienced. And to this day, if I have a problem, I live in the United States, if I have a problem, I go to my doctors in Montreal, because the doctors in Montreal don't see medicine as a business. I'm always skeptical, even though there's great doctors in healthcare, and maybe the top 1 or 2% of the healthcare industry is the best in the world in the United States, I worry that too many people see this as a business. I go to Canada for my checkups and diagnoses, because it's not a business. When I went to McGill, it's a strong university, competes with any Ivy League university in the United States that in those days charged tens of thousands of dollars. I went to school for about $200 Canadian a year, 120 or 30 US dollars a year, because it was heavily subsidized. And this was, you know, social welfare. If people were chronically unemployed, they had subsidies from the government, they had subsidies for decent housing, they had unemployment insurance. This was, you know, so this was Canada. In countries like Egypt that was did not have such a strong economy, there was basic food subsidies for sugar, for flour. There was basic health care and basic subsidies for education, I think, till about grade 6. So the state was involved. With neoliberalism, with structural adjustment, with Thatcherism and Reaganism, Reaganomics, there was sort of this notion that there should be a free economy, there should be no tariffs between countries. Countries had tariffs and protection of their workers, right? There were stronger unions. Workers were protected with tariffs. Nobody could flood the United States or Canada with goods coming from China or some other country where the production of things were much lower, the costs were much lower because the workers were protected. So all these barriers, tariffs, were limited. The power of the state to intervene in the economy and into society was weakened with this sort of free market system. And what the IMF and the World Bank did was that, you know, they basically enforced this new model of economic development and political activity. And if countries refused to participate in the system, it would be impossible for them to trade, to get loans and support from the IMF and the World Bank and be part of the global economy. So it was tremendous pressure on countries. Some countries resisted for a short period of time, but basically the state was limited in power and the free market system basically was entrenched. And we know from history that in a free market economic, political, capitalist system, some people will be successful and some won't. So in a way, as the state withdrew from a neoliberal perspective, from the G7 at the time, and there was sort of this push for free market capitalism, at the same time, and this is why I became so concerned about anti-Semitism in 1996, so I was a little late to the party as well, but at the same time, the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam, they also see the state as a problem. They see the state as a vestige of, neoliberal imperialism, of American intervention, of European colonialism, and the Islamists also want to destroy the state. So you have pressure from the Islamists to destroy the state, and significant pressure from the dominant countries of the world, the largest economies of the world, to limit the power of the state. So this was the perfect situation for Islamists to really start filling the vacuum. And we can see, throughout the world, as this neoliberal system has been in place, as the state is weakening, as identities are shifting. We used to have sort of this strong national identities, strong Israeli identity, strong Egyptian identity, strong Iraqi identity. So as the state becomes weaker, it was the glue that held society together. by providing education, by providing integration, right? The state was the glue. So as the state dissipates, fragmentation begins to happen. Economic and political fragmentation, economic, political, and social marginalization, and disconnection. And as I was saying earlier, the whole notion of identity, so identity politics become more and more important, because as people are displaced and marginalized from economic, social, and political processes, the identity is sort of the last space of resistance. So we see the rise of nationalisms, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, kind of extreme national movements based on identities, national identity, racist identities, and political Islam. We also see the beginning of states failing. More states around the world are failing in parts of the Middle East, sort of imploding. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Sudan, Somalia, to some extent even countries in South America. Really, as the state weakens, which was the glue holding society together, there's fragmentation. Uzi Rabi, who's going to give a lecture to you during this program, will look at how the map of the Middle East is basically a figment of our imagination of the past. That the states and these borders that we see on our maps don't really exist any longer, because the borders are porous and new identities are emerging. Kurdish identities, different types of identities in the region are emerging, clan identities are emerging, and the state is becoming weak. So, in a sense, this is, in a way, a crisis of modernity. And the crisis of modernity is brought on by neoliberal globalization. So on the one hand, globalization is bringing people together as never before. So we could put on a conference like this. People from all over the world can come to Oxford, and travel for certain groups of people are made easier. So we're coming together through social media, telecommunications, travel. So on the upper side of globalization, we get to interconnect, we get to consume similar goods, services, and products. There's, luxury goods that were only the hallmarks of, fancy hotels and fancy cars and fancy designer clothes. 30, 40 years ago was basically the hallmark of certain global cities like New York and Paris and London, maybe Milan, Rome. But today, you can have a cappuccino in Warsaw and you can buy Prada in Cape Town, right? So the globalization of luxury goods, services, hotels, there's Ritz-Carltons and Four Seasons and all this stuff all over the world. 40 years ago, there were unique hotels in just a few places. Now it's globalized. So globalization brings people together as never before, goods, services, and people. And at the same time, globalization sort of marginalizes and sort of settles people as never before. More and more people are disconnected from social, economic, and political processes. So there's the emergence of massive differentiation and global and marginalization. So in a sense, those of us on the receiving end of globalization are stuck in time and space. Those of us on the implementing side of globalization enjoy the capacity, if you will, to cross time and space. So time and space, if you're fixed in time and space, if you're stuck in a ghetto, in a township, in a rural area, you're on the receiving end of globalization. If you're in an urban environment, in a fancy building, fancy institution, you get to travel the world, you're on the implementing side of globalization. So for some who are truly some are truly global, some are stuck in time and in locality. So being local in a globalized world is a sign of deprivation and degradation. An integral part of the globalization process is progressive spatial segregation, separation, and exclusion, neo-tribal and fundamentalist tendencies which reflect and articulate the experience of people on the receiving end of globalization are as much a legitimate reaction to globalization as the widely acclaimed hybridization of top culture, the culture of the globalized top, and there's a breakdown in communication between the global elites and the ever more localized rest. So in a sense, this is what's happening internationally. So in a way, there's a crisis of, I would call a crisis of modernity and a crisis in the economic system. And this is giving rise to extremism and totalitarianism. So I think, in a way, these are the social, economic, and political conditions that are giving rise to this moment. So the Muslim Brotherhood, Trumpism, nationalism in Europe, in Hungary, in Brexit in the UK, is sort of addressing those who are on the receiving end of globalization. And there's a backlash against, in a sense, the elite. We have in the classroom people who are claiming that Israel is an apartheid, racist, fascist state. The Saids, Foucault and Said were very close to the Iranian Revolutionary Movement. They thought the Iranian Revolutionary Movement was going to be akin to the French Revolution and Enlightenment, so they said. They never looked at the contradictions of the philosophy of the Muslim Brotherhood or what the exiled leaders of the Iranian Revolutionary regime, were articulating. So I don't understand how we can speak in the classroom and label the Zionist entity as a problem, as an apartheid colonial entity, and at the same time, literally, support the Islamist social movement. Because this Islamist social movement of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary regime wants to liberate the region from all the vestiges of colonialism, imperialism, to free the people. And from the post-colonial perspective, from the liberal post-colonial Western perspective, there's this agenda of freeing those who were once colonized. So there's this interconnection between these two social movements. This is the Red-Green Alliance. In 1983, Edward Said said, and I think this is very important, that he's the last remaining Jewish intellectual, and that he was the only one that was capable of inheriting the Frankfurt School of Thought. The Frankfurt School of Thought, as many of you know, was a very important perspective, framework of understanding society, led by incredible intellectuals who were predominantly Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany and Europe. And they created the Frankfurt School. And Said said in 1983 that he was the only one capable of inheriting the legacy of the Frankfurt School because he was the last Jewish intellectual, real Jewish intellectual, that the Jewish professors in America became fat scribes in the suburbs, and that the Palestinians were the Jews and the Israelis were the Nazis. And when he said this in 1983, people thought he had a bad day. But this is the discourse today, right? Which is extraordinary. And it's extraordinary in the sense that this shift in the discourse where the Jews are the Nazis and the Palestinians are the Jews, and that progressive people like Judith Butler and others could side with political Islam to this day. Judith Butler famously said 15 years ago that Hamas and Hezbollah need to be understood as part of the progressive left, the progressive global left. And she said recently that what happened on October the 7th, as Natan was saying, was a form of resistance. I was at Columbia University with Larry Amsel for a teach-in in the social work department in early November of 2023. And we heard presentations from a group of people who were brilliant. They were professors and doctoral students at Columbia University, one of the best universities in the United States, if not the world. And they were masters at post-colonial theory, of philosophy, of ethics, of gender studies. Gender studies. I grew up in a home, my mother was part of the UN year of the Why Not, 1975, the year of the woman. You know, I grew up with feminists, real feminists. And they were saying that what happened on October the 7th was a form of resistance, that Israel is an occupying entity and the occupation needs to end by all means necessary, by any means necessary, and that the, what I would call murder and rape of Israeli citizens was a form of resistance. And they justified this as master scholars. They understand post-colonial thought, of post-colonial theory, of gender studies, and they were using this lexicon in the most brilliant, educated way to justify the murder and rape of Israelis. And they also, and we're not talking about occupied territories, we're talking about all of the occupation, from the river to the sea. That no Jew has the right to be on the land because it's a settler, white supremacist apartheid project. And we have progressive professors of feminism, of gender studies, saying that the sexual brutalization occurred, but it happened because the people are resisting the occupation. And the resistance to the occupation is justified. And anybody who supports the occupation, i.e., Jewish professors and Jewish students at Columbia University, are the enemy. So here we have the Red-Green Alliance. Here we have professors and scholars and doctoral students who are masters. They've mastered the literature. I would say they're immoral and unethical and misguided, but they're brilliant scholars. And they reminded me of the brilliant scholars of Nazi Europe that laid the foundation for the Holocaust. They were not only justifying the murder of Israelis, of all Israelis on the land, they were justifying the murder of Jews all over the world that support the Zionist entity. And it was mind-boggling at some level. So we discussed these issues, you know, talk about Said and Foucault, and how the current intellectual moment is demonizing Israel and demonizing Zionism and demonizing the Jewish people, and we discuss it conceptually. But listening to these professors and these doctoral students at Columbia University, and then realizing and seeing that Jewish students and faculty at Columbia University, one of the best universities in the world, have to do courses online because they did not feel safe to go onto the campus and go into their classroom. So for 40 years, my generation, we dealt with Said and Foucault and the post-modernity and the progressive characters in our faculty and in our departments and in our classroom, and we engaged them. I took courses with Said at St. Anthony's College. I took lectures from Chomsky, and Paul Gilroy, an old friend, right, who doesn't speak to me anymore because I'm a Zionist. He said I'm a nice guy. He'll write letters of support for my career, but he doesn't want to be seen with me anymore because I'm a Zionist. We engaged these scholars. We engaged these ideas. David Harris engaged them and paid the price. We all engaged and paid the price. But we dealt with it at an intellectual, political level, and it was interesting. It was. I would, when I was a student here, I would sit with scholars who were on this, disciples of Said and students of Said and scholars from the Middle East, and they would, present their arguments to me, and I'd go back and, read their papers or read their texts, and we would engage, and we would have these ongoing discussions and debates, and it was intellectually stimulating. But if we think back, and hindsight is 2020, we were engaging people who wanted to destroy the Jewish people. And fast forward, it's like 30, 40 years down the road, And what was taking place in the School of Social Work at Columbia University, which is taking place in the philosophy departments of Berkeley, and in Harvard University, and has set the discourse to the point where people are calling for the murder of Israelis and the murder of people who support them. So the Islamists are trying physically to do it, and the intellectuals in the West are justifying it. And the intellectuals in the West are not only justifying it, young Americans are going to these universities. They're being inculcated in this ideology and worldview. And these are the best future professors and journalists and leaders of industry and political leaders. So So I don't know if I've answered your question, but we have to, I think, understand at this moment that, and I'm going to go into it in my next lecture, but the war that's being waged on the Jews, the war that's being waged on democracy, really, the front line is the universities. And in the work that ISGAP is doing, we have a whole team of amazing scholars. Lev is here, he's working on the project, and Sima, of what we call follow the money. Qatar, which has a bay'ah, a spiritual oath with the Muslim Brotherhood, is giving tens of billions of dollars to American universities as we speak. So Qatar, a country which has adopted the worldview of the Muslim Brotherhood, i.e. to destroy the state of Israel, to murder Jewish people, to subjugate women, to kill gay people, to destroy democracy, is giving the most important institution in our democracy billions of dollars, and it's helping to change the discourse. It's empowering the Saids and the Foucaults and the people that are demonizing the Jewish people in the state of Israel. 40 years ago, as the state was strong and there were tariffs and boundaries between the economies of different countries, I'm not so sure before neoliberalism that universities would behave as corporations seeking out money for profit. At least in most countries, less and less, the state supported universities where this would never happen. Not in Europe and in Canada, and not so much, I don't think, in the United States. So I think this is a product of neoliberalism, but it's a whole longer story. And the media of record, the demonization, the dehumanization, the delegitimization of Israel and the Jewish people and our connection to the land, there's an onslaught. And it's become part of the popular culture. And it's not rational. It's not rational that young people in the West who think they're progressive are supporting political Islam. And you can make the argument that the largest victims of political Islam are Muslims, as they try to transform, these institutions and societies in Muslim countries. So yeah, it's extraordinary. And women. And minorities, and ethnic minorities, national minorities. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary that, as it was so well articulated yesterday, that after the October the 7th, after October the 7th, that at universities, from the classroom to the encampments, right, that young people were supporting Hamas in the United States of America. So you had SJP on campus. SJP is connected to the American Muslims for Palestine, AMP. AMP comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood, funded and created and supported by the Muslim Brotherhood. So SJP, we've been arguing, if you look at ISGAP's reports from 2019 and 2023, we've been arguing and trying to demonstrate that SJP is connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. But the ignorance. You had Hillels, who would not take our work seriously, that were trying to create Shabbatons with SJP students to make a rapprochement, to have dialogue. And nobody took the time to study the ideology and the roots of the SJP. So when SJP, a few days after the pogrom, said that they're supporting not the Palestinians and not the people of Gaza, but they're supporting Hamas, that we are Hamas, we are the struggle. And progressive young people joined on the campus with all the slogans you're saying. It's extraordinary. And Rashid Khalidi, former Minister of Information for the PLO, the Edward Said Professor at Columbia University, extraordinary, right? He had a retirement party a few months ago, and he was applauded for his role in creating the student movement, not only at Columbia, but in the United States. So from the classroom to the encampment, from the encampment to the subways, to the streets, to the airports, to the museums, to Jewish homes of journalists, of political leaders and professors, protesting outside their homes, burning things on their lawn. So think of the old days, and there's a lot of questions, and I'll try and get to you as quickly as possible. Instead of Middle East studies, instead of SJP, instead of this gender studies that justify the Judith Butlers and the Foucaults and the Saids that are justifying this, instead of students showing up with kafirs and COVID masks, chanting things about Jews and Zionists, could you imagine, and getting money from Qatar, getting money from the Muslim Brotherhood and other nefarious actors, could you imagine if apartheid South Africa still existed, or Nazi Germany still existed, and instead of Middle East studies and post-colonial studies and gender studies, we had centers of eugenics and of biological studies and of theology and a philosophy that promoted notions of racism and antisemitism. And the professors were getting money from Nazi-occupied Germany and apartheid South Africa, and it helped them to do science. And instead of SJP coming with kafirs and COVID masks, we had students with white sheets covering their identity, and the professors of eugenics and theology came to the encampments to do teach-ins with them. And then the presidents of the universities in this environment could not bring themselves to condemn the call for the extermination of members of their staff, their colleagues, and the students that they're entrusted with. Imagine. So I think in terms of the discourse, we have to become just mindful of how far things have gone. I'll say this. I think we really need to become mindful of how anti-Semitism is deeply rooted in society. When it comes to the study of anti-Semitism, as I was saying earlier, most of our assessments are descriptive. And we haven't, or maybe we were blinded by liberalism, that many of us thought that anti-Semitism died in Auschwitz. But we now know it was the Jews who died in Auschwitz, and that anti-Semitism survived, mutated, but survived. We have to understand that anti-Semitism, as painful as it may be to hear, is deeply rooted in Western society, Western Christian society, Western liberal society, in the United Kingdom, in France, in Belgium, in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, I can list more, and in the United States of America. It's institutionalized, it's deep. And the golden age that we were all hoping to, continue, I don't know if it's finished, but it's certainly damaged.